I'll pass the people.
I'll probably
Rashid, can you pull your motorcycle over?
I'm trying to pull it over. I'm trying to turn the motor on.
Oh, you gotta park it, babe.
That's what you hear. That's what you hear.
Welcome. I'm gonna tell you who's all is on the call. So we have Comrade Sojourner, Comrade Kelsey, Comrade Buzz, Comrade Charlie, Comrade Nathaniel. Someone is joining us from Amherst, Massachusetts. Who is that?
Wow.
Who's there?
I think that's me. Like I'm from
No,
Tennessee.
that's you, Nathaniel. I see you, but there's someone. Are you on two
Like that's
phones?
where I am right now. That's where I am right now. So.
That's so weird. That is so weird.
It's
a different number, though.
Can you see it? Can you see what I'm seeing?
Yeah, comrade, I can see what you're seeing. It's a different number. It's 413-345-9908.
It might be my college. I have no idea.
Hello. All power to the people. This is Comrade Rasan. Sorry, that's my number. I was having trouble.
Comrade who?
Rasan.
Comrade Rasan. All power to the people. Okay.
Rasan. Oh, thank you. I'm an old lady. Listen, my hearing is going. My hearing. Shut up, Rashid. Welcome, Comrade Rasan. It's good to finally meet you. I'm happy that you're here.
Thank you. It's good to be on a call with you all. Power to the people.
Okay, this is exciting. So Comrade Nathaniel and Comrade Rasan, do you guys know each other?
No,
I've never met him. I guess I have to.
I just figured since you all were both in Massachusetts, I don't know, it's a big state, I suppose. Well, you know each other now, so welcome to everyone. I guess I'll turn it over to my comrade what's your name, sir? Rashid?
No name. Comrade, no name. All right, all proud to the people, comrades. Glad to have you back on. Let's see. Here's the PE session. The article that we're going to be addressing this week is Readings in the Pig Playbook, reading number 1, which addresses the pig tactic of scapegoating bad apples. And I chose this article because I think it's kind of relevant to the existing situation of unprecedented importance, the situation that developed after the murder, literally the lynching of George Floyd, and what followed, which was an unprecedented level of public uprising which spanned the globe. There were literally millions of people who rose up in response to witnessing this lynching, and the system had to take action to try to redeem itself, to reestablish its credibility, its legitimacy in the eyes of the public, especially world opinion, where it has always tried to portray itself as a melting pot where people of all nationalities, of all complexions are treated equally and fairly. And once again, it's been put on display for the utter hypocrisy that actually plays out every day on the streets with relations of people of color and the poor with the power structure and the foundational forces of state power in America, which are the police, the military, the prisons, and so on. So I wanted to, in that context, use this article, as a springboard to have a larger discussion with you, comrades, about, present circumstances related to the recent verdict and prosecution of the pig Derek or ex-pig Derek Chauvin. And now there's been a recent indictment, a federal indictment issued against him and the other cops who were involved in the lynching of George Floyd. So with that said, I just want to briefly go over the article where the overall subject and the overall position is to expose the game that the pigs play, which is scapegoating bad apples. How where there are systemic crimes, systemic wrongs committed by the system itself against people, when instances of abuse become public knowledge and the system is put on wide public display and criticism, and there's a public reaction or backlash because of abuses, then the system typically will scapegoat a low-level individual or group of individuals as bad apples who are portrayed as deviants who acted against the principles and the mores of the establishment and committed some heinous act. And there will be an attempt to distance the system from these behaviors and make it look like these are, people that who just because of, some immoral bent of the individual carried out some abusive acts. And in many cases, when these people are scapegoated and they are penalized, put on public display, show trials, that sort of thing, after the fact, the system will exonerate them after, a short period of time passes. It still doesn't want to give the impression to those who behave in this manner that its actors will be thrown under the bus by the system or will be penalized by the system so as to demoralize people from working with the system and carrying out a lot of the atrocities that happen. So in many cases when there are so-called bad apples scapegoated, they end up not being penalized for long. They'll come back and they'll be exonerated by some high-ranking official, as happened in the example I gave with the Lieutenant William Cowley, who was involved in the My Lai murders, the massacres at My Lai in 1968 in Vietnam. And I think you can see perhaps that the stage was set in a similar way with the Derek Chauvin proceedings. And these were things that, I was talking to some comrades about the refusal to sequester the jury and the allowance likely of people on the jury who they knew had some prior exposure to the publicity surrounding the execution, the lynching of George Floyd, and how because of the extensive publicity and the failure to transfer venue to another location for the trial, they were going to likely use this to reverse his conviction. And if he was brought back for further prosecution, likely it's going to be a whole lot lesser criminal penalty or charges will be prosecuted against him, and the penalty will likely be a lot more lenient because they don't want to demoralize, people who work in the system that do carry out these atrocities on a regular basis from things that they generally do that the system allows them to do, and it's just part of the system's business as usual. But to begin, the first incident that I covered was, as I said, the My Lai massacre that happened in March of 1968 in Vietnam, where the Army's Charlie Company carried out a massacre in a village of women, children, and elderly people. Most of the people, the males, the military-age males, had fled the villages in South Vietnam because of, the just indiscriminate murder and carrying out of atrocities against military-age males, just as part of their whole campaign to eradicate potential resistance against the United States military and their genocidal war against Vietnam. So what they did was, they had been actually given instructions, this Charlie Company, by their captain to invade this village and to literally, quote, kill everything that moves, unquote. And he was questioned by some of the soldiers, do you mean, women, kids, etc.? He said, kill everything that moves. And he actually was stating what was the official strategy in South Vietnam that had been communicated through Nixon and his advisor, who at the time was Henry Kissinger. And they had issued formal instructions to the military, the U.S. Army in South Vietnam, everything that flies on everything that moves. That was the literal command that was given to the South Vietnamese, the forces, the military, U.S. military forces in South Vietnam, that anything that moves, that they should use any weapons, any artillery, any air support, air power to just literally exterminate anything they see moving, in which you obviously include the civilians. And in many cases, when they would massacre civilians, they would falsely document it as gun battles that had been carried out against what they called Viet Cong, or resistance fighters in South Vietnam. But the vast majority of the killings were of civilians, primarily women, children, and elderly people. And in many cases, they avoided combat with the actual resistance forces because of the high attrition rates and the high mortality rates against, American forces. So they were consciously targeting civilians and falsifying body counts as actual, what they called Viet Cong soldiers, when, by and large, all they were killing and targeting were civilians and targeting, villages and that sort of thing. So in any case, in the case of the My Lai massacre, they went in, systematically exterminated the entire village of over 500 people. Children, they pumped bullets at point blank range into the heads of babies. They killed the livestock. They went on a systemic orgy, raping and murdering women, young girls, etc. And they even stopped, for a period during the afternoon to eat lunch. And then after they ate lunch, they commenced with, their massacre of the entire village. The incident just was chalked up as a basic gun battle where they claimed the U.S. military commander, William Westmoreland, he recorded it as just a basic gun battle that took place where a few hundred so-called Viet Cong soldiers had been killed. But what happened was a little over a year later, one of the participants in the killing, Ron Rittenhour, he came back stateside and he took his story to the media. He kept trying to contact the media, and finally, Seymour Hersh, one of the major reporters during that period, he took up the story and he listened to what Rittenhour, had revealed. So when he went into the Army archives, he found photographs in the Army's array of photographs of, various battles that were supposedly had taken place in South Vietnam. He found the pictures of the massacre and, multitudes of villagers who had been dumped in a ditch on the side of the road, which had, large numbers of women and babies laying in the ditch who had been, dumped in the ditch after they had been systematically murdered. And from that, it was a big stink. It was a big scandal over the My Lai incident. So they targeted William Calley, who was the lowest ranking officer involved in that. He was a lieutenant, and he was the one who led the charge on My Lai. They targeted him with prosecution. They painted him out, scapegoated him as a bad apple, said he was mentally unstable, and, it was his fault that this massacre took place, etc. So as a result, he ended up being prosecuted, and he was made out to be the sole, element who was responsible for the massacre. But what followed was an Army investigation that was staged to try and cover up the My Lai exposure and to find out, or basically to try to find out why
you have 1 minute remaining,
or supposedly had been done, didn't produce information that enabled them to prevent it from becoming public or publicized, especially when there was photographic footage of what had happened. So from that, it ended up coming out that, there were multitudes of ranking officers who were responsible, and it led to an investigation and inquiry by General Pierce, and it was called the Pierce investigation, where he looked into prior investigations of My Lai, but his thing was not to expose or investigate any other massacres, but to determine, why the My Lai massacre had not been suppressed and, how it was allowed to come out. So in that investigation, it was found that another massacre had taken place just up the road from My Lai.
Thank you for using GTL.
I'm back off out to the people.
Okay.
Okay, so basically, there were a number of investigations that were staged. There was a war crimes working group that was created, and basically the objective of all of these structures was to try to water down the effects of public exposure of the My Lai massacre, them finding that there were My Lai type massacres all over the place, in South Vietnam. They were just committed on almost a daily basis throughout South Vietnam. And one had occurred just right up the road at another village called My Key by the Bravo Company, where over 400 civilians had been killed and systematically raped in the exact same way that Charlie Company had carried out its massacre of the villages at My Lai. And essentially, the War Crimes Working Group and William Westmoreland, who was the U.S. military commander, who was controlling pretty much the entire strategy of warfare in South Vietnam and North Vietnam, was to cover up these massacres, was to portray them as, when the ones that did come out, such as My Key, to portray them as crimes that were carried out by South Vietnamese soldiers and not the U.S. military, and to basically just to water down the public exposure and public reaction, potential public reaction to these, these literal war crimes and genocidal executions of civilians. And again, this was all part of a systemic strategy, a stated strategy of massacring civilians, as a result of which millions of Vietnamese, South and North Vietnamese, were murdered and massacred, throughout the Vietnamese War, primarily civilians. And again, in order to conceal what was an established policy of the military, and what were blatant war crimes, crimes of genocide, they scapegoated one single low-ranking military officer as the proponent of a single act that happened to, come out publicly exposed because of soldiers, coming back to the United States and pretty much just agitating to the point that he finally got mainstream media to bring attention to and expose, what had happened in one particular incident. So they tried to isolate that incident as a one-off aberration. This isn't the common behavior of the military, and they scapegoated this one soldier and made him out to be a monster, when in actuality, the entire military command, multitudes of generals, etc., were carrying out these same types of massacres and systematically targeting heavy artillery on civilians and killing people by the thousands and hundreds in the same manner. But they didn't want this to become public knowledge. So, they scapegoated they created a bad apple and scapegoated him as, solely responsible for this type of behavior. And similarly, the same sort of thing happened with respect to the torture scandal that came out in relation to, the Iraq War in Abu Ghraib in 2004, when the photographs came out, exposing a lot of this torture and sexual abuse of Iraqi civilians in Abu Ghraib, which was a prison that had been occupied by the U.S. military, and they were using to house, captured civilians, Iraqi civilians, many of whom were not charged or even legitimately suspected of any types of criminal behaviors or any types of attacks on the military. They were just randomly sweeping up people who may have been breaking curfew, or just people who they were trying to use as examples to basically terrorize the population. and they were bringing them into Abu Ghraib. And in particular, they started to target it when in 2003 there was an increase in popular resistance against the U.S. military's occupation of Iraq after the U.S. military began carrying out atrocities against civilians, which basically provoked mass insurrection against the U.S. military occupation. So they brought in General Jeffrey Miller, who had been actually stationed since 2002 at Guantanamo Bay, and he was being used to use Guantanamo Bay in Cuba, the military base in Cuba, as a torture laboratory to develop new methods of imposing psychological and physical torture on people who were captured by the U.S. military to try to break them and to extract information from them, and literally to terrorize other people using their abuse as a means of making an example and scaring other people into submitting to America's military domination and military operations abroad. So the photographs came out of people, multitudes of civilians being sexually degraded, physically abused, tortured, murdered by U.S. military forces at Abu Ghraib. And there were several U.S. military soldiers who were featured in a number of these photographs. They came out because they were sending them back home, taking pictures on their phones and those sorts of things. So when the pictures became public, the majority of the soldiers who were targeted, they were scapegoated as, doing things that were not accepted or not authorized by the U.S. military and torturing these civilians, and they were prosecuted. But it was found by investigations conducted in 2006 by Human Rights First, Human Rights Watch, and New York University that hundreds of instances of torture had taken place at Abu Ghraib, and they were being carried out by basically all of the soldiers who were stationed there under the command of General Jeffrey Miller and those who followed him at Abu Ghraib. These were systemic practices. This was authorized U.S. military policy at Abu Ghraib, this physical torture and physical degradation of the captured citizens. So after the soldiers were being targeted for prosecution, an attorney named Scott Morton from the New York Bar Association, he conducted an investigation and found that the soldiers who were being targeted for prosecution were primarily those who were revealed in the photographs that had been leaked to the public, to the media, and they were being targeted because of the embarrassment that had been brought against the U.S. military, and particularly Donald Rumsfeld, as the ranking civilian, supervisor and orchestrator of military policies for the U.S. military in Iraq, and that they were being pretty much targeted in order to delegitimize these behaviors as not being part of, what America does in its military campaigns abroad. So following that, a major general named Antonio Taguba, he investigated also and issued a detailed report called the Taguba Report into the torture at Abu Ghraib, which revealed the systematic tortures of civilians at Abu Ghraib, the involvement of the entire military command there, that these were institutionalized practices that had been formally set up and carried out under the direction of, General Jeffrey Miller, that he had developed the torture techniques that were being used at Abu Ghraib in Guantanamo Bay. And he had developed these torture techniques as part of, the experimentation into torture techniques at Guantanamo. And after Guantanamo was used as a laboratory to perfect and refine these methods, they were being used as a formal, military policy at Abu Ghraib. Several years later, the Undersecretary of Defense Policy, Douglas Feast, he also he warned U.S. civilian officials to not look at the Taguba report, and he charged that it was the result of whistleblowers who were going to be targeted for investigation and prosecution, that no one should investigate or review the Taguba report as far as high-ranking U.S. officials, and he tried to basically cover up, what came out in the Taguba report. When it became such a large scandal that could not be concealed anymore because of the media attention, the soldiers and their attorneys exposing that what they had done was part of, former U.S. military strategy at Abu Ghraib. They were only doing what they were instructed to do. Then that's when Obama, after he was elected, he came out and formally admitted that these atrocities had been committed. And he denounced torture as, acceptable U.S. military policy. But this was only at the point that they could no longer conceal that this was actual formal military practice in Iraq, systematically torturing civilians, killing civilians in the process of carrying out torture, etc. So before all of this came, out as acknowledged and admitted established policy, they scapegoated a handful of soldiers and made it out as if they were, the cause of these abuses, and that, the American government, the establishment, was innocent of these types of behavior. And similarly, I gave a third example, was an incident that I had witnessed when I was confined in Texas at the Bill Clements unit, where they literally murdered another prisoner who was obviously mentally ill, and I witnessed the entire incident in 2013. A guy named Christopher Wolverton, and Wolverton, he received he had a mental condition that he would go into states where he just wouldn't communicate with people. And he also had a urinary tract disorder where they had to bring him a catheter where he would have to urinate through a catheter. And he had a lot of medical issues. He had chronic urinary tract infections, so medical staff were in contact with him a lot. They came to his cell, a few days before the incident happened where, he lost his life. And we're trying to give him his catheter and his medication, and he was just unresponsive. He was laying in the cell floor, refusing to respond to staff. Obviously, he was in medical distress because some of the staff, I heard them saying that he had urine in the floor under him. They could see blood in his urine on the floor around him. He wasn't responding to anybody. He wasn't eating, and he had gone probably 3 or 4 days without eating at all. Guards would come to his cell, offer him his meals. He wouldn't respond. Someone would comment, "Oh, he's just laying in the floor, not moving, not saying anything, and not responding." So finally, a nurse came to his door named Killian, and this was on the 22nd. She came to his cell and asked him if he wanted his catheter. He didn't respond. The guards told her at the time that he hadn't eaten his meals in like 3 days. So she told him, okay, if he doesn't accept his next meal, which was his lunch meal, then y'all need to bring him out as policy, requires. This is the basic protocol. If a prisoner doesn't eat for 3 days, they have to take him to medical to be weighed and his vital signs taken, etc. So she told the guards if he doesn't accept his lunch meal today, then y'all need to bring him out of the cell, bring him to medical, as policy requires, so that I can take his vital signs and his weight, etc. So he didn't accept his lunch meal. When he didn't accept his lunch meal, they brought the nurse to his cell. He wasn't responsive. The warden came to his cell. The major came to his cell. He wasn't responding. He was laying in the cell on the floor, completely naked. So they started laughing. They were making jokes about him. He was retarded, SOB, stupid, this, that, and the other. Just basically degrading and insulting him. And they assembled a cell extraction team. Now, he also suffered from asthma. And I heard them repeatedly remark, Nurse Killian included, that they could not gas him because he had asthma. This is just basic policy. When a prisoner has a respiratory condition, they cannot use chemical agents on them, tear gas, OC gas, etc. So this one particular abusive guard came to his cell and named Andrew Gratz and started cursing him, verbally abusing him, otherwise telling him he was going to get up off the floor, he was going to gas him. When he still didn't respond, he still laid in the floor in medical distress. They gassed him repeatedly. They emptied an entire canister, probably like a 12-ounce canister of gas in the cell on him. They further opened the cell door and ran in, with the group of body armored guards, and they jumped on him, kicked him around, beat him up, handcuffed him, and brought him out the cell. So when they brought him out the cell, they wrapped a sheet around him. They brought him upstairs. He could barely walk, and they brought him directly past my cell because my cell was in the corner right by the door that they had to take him through to take him to medical. And he kept saying, in a real low voice, "I can't breathe. I can't breathe." And his face was covered in the gas. The gas that they use, it has like a real bright orangish red color to it. And anything that it comes into contact with, it stains it, including your skin. So he had gas all over his face. They had put like a construction mask on his face, which they do under the pretext of saying they are trying to prevent a prisoner from spitting on them. So they had a construction mask on his face, and his face was basically covered in gas. So he was saying, I could hear him saying through the mask, "I can't breathe." And he was gagging, "I can't breathe." Now again, this prisoner had asthma, and they were under medical orders. It was in his medical records that they could not use chemical agents on him because he had a respiratory condition. So they were literally dragging him up the stairs. He could barely walk. And I started to protest. I said, "Man, the man says he can't breathe. He can barely walk. Y'all need to take that off his face, man." And I'm like, "Why did y'all gas that man? That man needs some medical help. He needs some oxygen. You know he has asthma. Y'all weren't supposed to spray him with gas." So they basically ignored me, but they had an audio camera, that they use whenever they use force on a prisoner, premeditated force for cell extraction. They have a portable audio video camera. So I'm stating this, both to try to appeal to them to get him some help, but also for that audio video, recorder to hear what I'm saying. That the man is in admitted medical distress. They knew they weren't supposed to spray him. They left him down there for like 4 days, unresponsive, and gassed him for no reason because he literally had done nothing. He wasn't being disruptive. He wasn't any threat. He's a little small guy. They know he has mental problems. And instead of getting him medical help, they decided to use force that they weren't even authorized to use on him. So they took him to medical. He probably was gone about 2 minutes, literally. They brought him right back, dragged him down the stairs, and put him in another cell, stark naked, still covered in gas. They didn't decontaminate him. And less than 5 hours later, he was dead. They came back. He wasn't responsive. They came with nurses, a gurney. They ran in the cell. He hadn't moved the entire time, the entire 5 hours after he had been placed back in cell. There was no movement. So they ended up rushing into the cell with the medical department, guards, etc. And he was dead. They found him dead in the cell. So it was revealed he died from asphyxiation. Again, they murdered him, literally gassed him when they knew he had asthma. He had already been in medical distress. They did nothing for him. So I was able to get some people on the outside my publisher wrote an article about it. I wrote a statement about what happened. I got several other prisoners to write grievances about what we witnessed they did to him. And as a result of outside exposure and people calling and complaining, they targeted the nurse named Killian, and they fired her. But it was known that the use and abuse of gas like this was something done on a chronic basis at Bill Clinton's unit. In fact, an article had been written in the Texas Tribune just a month before that had identified Bill Clinton's unit as the Texas prison that had the highest rate of uses of force and abuses of tear gas, OC gas on prisoners in the entire Texas prison system. So they frequently abused.
You have 1 minute remaining.
In the manner that they did to, Christopher Wolverton. There had been a number of instances of prisoners suffering, serious injury because of that, and prisoners dying from abuses of force at the prison. But they targeted this one nurse and fired her when, outside scrutiny and complaints came to bear but it was totally ignored that, this was a systematic practice at the prison of abusing gas. The wardens had allowed the abuse of gas to happen against him when they knew he was under medical orders not to be subjected to chemical weapons. And even the grievances that we filed, the responses we got were it was none of our business. They weren't going to inquire of us what actually happened. There was going to be no investigation involving witnesses or anything. And they told us basically to mind our business, stay out of it. So again, this was a case where one individual, a low-ranking individual, was scapegoated, but the system.
Thank you for using GTL.
So basically, this same pattern, which I gave several examples of the system using to pretty much exonerate itself of the guilt of abuses, systematic brutality against people, of targeting, a single low-ranking individual that works within the establishment, throwing them under the bus to try to paint the system as innocent and the abuses as caused by, a few isolated individuals. This is a systematic response that is made by this system. And we see the exact same process which was carried out in relation to the case of the lynching of George Floyd. And I guess you can pretty much see, if we look at the pattern of the instances where some cops have been, the few that have been prosecuted or actions have been taken after there have been highly publicized instances of abuse. This is how the system responds. This is how it reestablishes its legitimacy. It tries to tamp down scandals that expose these systematic abuses. And this is basically the process that it uses to try to subvert the actions of the masses when they come out in opposition against the system, when they have seen that these types of abuses have happened, and revolutionaries start to educate and organize the masses and bring attention to the systemic nature of these sorts of abuses. They will isolate and target an individual. They will make the system appear to take action against the individual to make it look as if the system is intolerant of these types of abuses. And they will try to steer the masses who have been radicalized in response to these types of exposures back into supporting and reestablishing belief and trust in the system itself. And this is exactly what you've seen with this whole response to this George Floyd situation. They have used prosecuting Derek Chauvin after there have been multitudes of systematic abuses and murders of Black, brown, indigenous people, poor people by the pigs. When it reached the point where they had an unprecedented level of mass resistance, and the world saw and bore witness to the way that poor people of color are treated by the cops and have been complaining for generations and protesting and struggling against for generations, when finally the world saw itself, how we are really treated by the pigs. And they rose up against the establishment in America, and they took the side of the oppressed masses in America, and you had literally a multi-class resistance and a class-based resistance against the establishment. It wasn't just what had occurred like in the 60s, where the uprisings were confined to the oppressed communities. This, the resistance that took place this time spanned all different classes, the middle class, students, and it spanned the world. There were protests, millions and millions of people inside of America and across the globe rose up in protest against these abuses. So America had to try to re-legitimize, reestablish its credibility, its legitimacy, and to distance itself from these behaviors. So they did what? They targeted a scapegoat. They made Derek Chauvin out to be an isolated bad apple. They made the system appear to be the source of redress. It was going to denounce these types of behavior. They would use, ranking officials to say, well, we don't endorse this type of behavior. We don't condone this. He violated the law. He violated our policies, our trainings on use of the force. So they portrayed him as a bad apple, and they scapegoated him. And this is generally how the system works. And they have now pretty much stamped out a lot of the protests that was taking place in the streets. The voice of the revolutionary elements who had, were reaching out to the masses to educate them on the systemic abuses of the system and how it cannot be reformed. It cannot be resolved by going to Congress or looking to these, Democratic Party shields, so-called civil rights organizers, leaders, and attorneys, that this is something that's going to have to be staged and corrected through revolutionary struggle. They have taken the fire out of the masses. They have shifted attention to institutions and methods of reform as a solution, and this is how they do it. So with that said, I'd like to open the floor to, comrades on the call to, offer any comments or any thoughts you may have on the subject or any critique.
Just really quickly, I want to say that along with the conference info, I added the link to Rashid's original PIG Playbook article, and then there's also a link to an article that I wrote recently that uses Rashid's original article as the basis, but speaks specifically to the Chauvin verdict. I don't know how many of you offered this, but
And I would encourage the comrades to check out Chapabu's article. I haven't, I guess the pig's been playing games. I haven't been able to read the entire article. I only got like the very beginning of her piece, but I'd encourage the comrades to read that. And I'd like to hear from you all, your views on these methods, what you have observed in the streets with respect to the Derek Chauvin verdict, the response to the situation, the system's response to, the lynching of George Floyd. So, does anybody have anything they'd like to, bring to the table, criticisms, ideas, thoughts?
No one has any thoughts on the recent trial and verdict?
So do the comrades feel that the system is addressing this situation in a way that resolves the contradictions that led to the death of George Floyd and the continued problem of cops murdering, unarmed people of color and poor people?
I have a question. I was wondering if you all think that, what they did with the Derek Chauvin trial will be effective long term, for the summer onto the next few years, and suppressing.
That's a hard call to make because if you look at what happened in the 60s, specifically in 63, they did something similar, and I've spoken to that in other articles, in response to the systematic killings of, blacks in the poor black neighborhoods. The masses were in the streets revolting. They were starting to strike back, physically resisting a lot of the pig violence and that sort of thing. And they used the so-called civil rights leaders of that time. They were, constituted themselves at that time as the Big Six, who Martin Luther King was a part of the grouping. And they used them to try to subvert and counter the resistance that was taking place in the streets. And that's what happened when they staged the March on Washington in August of 63. And they thought by staging this March on Washington, where they portrayed the Democratic Party in a coalition with the Democratic Party and these civil rights leaders as the solution to to the problem of police violence and the basic of, substandard conditions in the black communities, they thought that that was going to suppress the resistance in the street, and it would, get people to look to the Democratic Party, the establishment, the courts as a solution. And it didn't work. In fact, Malcolm X, he issued his message to the grassroots speech where he said that this was going to lead to a long, hot summer because the people in the streets realized that they had been tricked, or the system had tried to trick them. They tried to subvert what was going to be a siege that the masses were, organizing at the grassroots to engage in Washington. They were going to occupy the Capitol and shut the whole Capitol down. But they used King and these other groups of civil rights leaders to subvert that whole siege on Washington and turn it into a one-day peaceful march. So the question would be, if there were elements who, amongst the masses, realized that this whole thing is a hoax, that the masses are simply being duped into looking to the system and belief in reform, with George Jackson, he pointed out one of the most effective methods of counter-revolution under, the present stage of fascism is reform, where you trick the people into believing or investing confidence in the system to fix its problems. It will split the mass movement because some people will want to look to the system and believe and trust in the system. But if you are able to, on a larger scale, show the people that this is only a trick, that they're attempting to subvert the initiative of the masses to get the masses out of the street, to counter-organizing against the system itself, if they realize that this is a trick, then no, it won't work. But if there are not elements amongst the masses agitating and organizing and educating them as to how this whole response to, the plague of pigs murdering, poor people of color in the streets, then yeah, it will still, and it may lead to a much bigger, a much more effective mass revolt, and the potential for revolutionary elements to organize the masses around genuine programs to change the balance of power within the communities and against the system. But if that doesn't happen, then it may effectively repress the reaction of the masses, but I don't think it's going to effectively repress it because the cops are not going to stop killing people. In fact, 24 hours after the verdict against Derek Chauvin, at least 9 or 10 people were murdered, unarmed black people were murdered, brown people by the police.
Yeah, I don't think it's. I think that last part, I have a lot of unity with that. The speed with which it happens has to do with how well this is sold to the people, but ultimately, eventually, it's not an effective measure because the people are losing their fear, and the people's consciousness is being raised, and I think we witnessed that. Especially with the rebellions of last summer that actually lasted into the fall. So ultimately, no, it won't be effective. But it's what we do with these types of opportunities that will determine how quickly we bring about the change that we want to see.
Have any thoughts on how we could enable the masses to realize the trick of this scapegoating, this pig, as a means of trying to get them out of the streets and to subvert the mass initiative and the ability of revolutionaries to organize this energy into something that will take the system in a more fundamental way?
I don't know if people heard that, Rashid. You were a little bit distorted.
Well, do the comrades have any thoughts on how we, revolutionaries, can bring the understanding to the masses that this is a trick and how to counter this trick so that we can reach them in a more or a deeper way to organize them to challenge the system on a more fundamental level to change the overall status quo?
all power to the people. Thank you for that question, comrade, and thank you for all your contributions in your writing and your analysis. I thought the piece was really brilliant, and I really like that question that you just offered in terms of like what we can do as far as the masses are concerned. I think like when you said Derek Chauvin, like thinking about Derek Chauvin as a scapegoat, I think that's such a provocative and compelling point that is certainly like not the way most media outlets are framing the verdict at all. So what would it look like to talk about Derek Chauvin as a scapegoat and understand that what we basically witnessed was we saw something that's basically treating a disease with a symptom of that disease, and that the disease is the state, the disease is the police state, and the symptom is like treating it through reform. And yeah, I appreciate the George Jackson quote as well. And I wonder what it would look like to talk to to reach the masses in a way to think about reform itself as a form of violence, as something that's inaugurating new forms of racialized violence rather than something that is anything like that's probable that will address the thing about any change. And so I think like language is important, and like the way you're speaking, I think is part of that way. So yeah, thank you for sharing.
So yeah, this I think it's important in response to your response, comrade, and also to take the question itself further. I think it's important that we take this message to the masses, through every available platform to educate them, because we have to be the tribune of the people. We have to be able to take a correct analysis to the people, where the system is always going to try to divert them from the truth. The unrepentant nature, the unreformable nature of the system overall, and to understand that power resides in the people, and power resides in our struggle to empower the people to change conditions in their interest and through their own independent and voluntary struggle. So we need to become involved in bringing this message to understand what this whole game is about, how it is, a systemic strategy that typically in these types of situations arise, and how we can't allow this to effectively neutralize the consciousness of the masses, to water down the masses ferment, that's been going on since the last year, and how we need to take a hold of the mass movement, the mass ferment, organized into the mass movement, where we can think about step by step fundamental change. So does anybody else have any thoughts or any ideas they'd like to bring to the table about
Hello, can y'all hear me? Hello, can y'all hear me?
Well, all right,
Yes, we can hear you.
Just say like that's our our job, our call to action, that we have to make the people see something different from what the narrative is that they're trying to push, their bag of tricks. And I've been even had people tell me personally, like I know a nurse that said like the same type of thing happened to her. So there was a prisoner laying in the cell. They had been deceased for a while, and they tried to leave it on her that she was the person that caused it. I think that is a common tactic. Is a common tactic in general for even the doctors in any type of malpractice to make the onus of what happens for the nurse. But yeah, definitely.
You have 1 minute remaining.
They're trying to keep this narrative going that, everything is fixed. They're doing what they're supposed to do this time, and hoping that people are going to stay quiet, and they're trying to open back up the country. Like Jersey has been closed for a while pretty much. The state is opening back up on Monday. So, and also the schools are starting to open back up when the schools have been closed all year. And I was saying to myself, like, why in the last few months of school are they pushing to open things back up? So maybe that's part of it. They're like, we're going to make sure that people are busy, people are back to work. So if people do figure out that there's still a lot of action that needs to be taken, people will be limited in what they can do because they need to go back to work. They're not free like they were, last summer. Last summer just kind of came together as a perfect storm. People were angry, people were out of work, and they had the time to get out there and do what they had to do.
Important, brilliant observation, Tom.
Thank you for using GTL.
I think that may be it. I'm not sure if it's count time there. He may not be able to call back for another half hour.
Okay. You want to give him a few minutes to come back?
I'll give him a few minutes.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. He's back.
Oh, he's back. Okay.
Yeah.
I'll pass to the
I was saying. Yeah, I think Comrade Sojourner, I think your comments are brilliant, and I agree with it. And that was something I was speaking to last year when I was kind of commenting on, part of why the masses were in the street because of the pressure, social pressure that has built up behind people being, quarantined in their homes. The lack of activity, the lack of diversion, and the stresses that had resulted from people being, cooped up in their homes, when the pressure built up, as a result of this isolation, it exploded. People exploded into the streets. They didn't have outlets for a lot of the energy that had pent up. It's like you're saying now, they're trying to open up the cities and get people back involved in social activities and in schools, et cetera. They're trying to find diversion, get people back out of their homes and into social activities that will kind of divert them from, pinning up the same sort of energy that happened last summer. So like there's a perfect storm. Prevent that sort of energy and the isolation and, from building again, where the people, their frustration at the sight of these types of atrocities will provoke them into, exploding back to the streets again and, the same sort of fermenting weapon, like it did last summer. So any of the comrades have any other thoughts or comments? All right. There's no other thoughts or any critiques or questions. I guess we can conclude this session. I appreciate all the comrades' participation. And with that, I will conclude our meeting for today. All power to the people.
All power to the people, comrades.
All power to the people.
All power to the people.